and we move on to our second presenters for today. So the second presentation is creating positive pedagogical change in EMI, impact from an innovative faculty professional development initiative in Taiwan. And talking to us are Dr. Meredith Doran, who is an associate teaching professor of applied linguistics at the Pennsylvania State University. She has extensive experience as a second language educator, program administrator, and social linguist. Research interests include faculty development in English medium instruction, language teacher education, English for specific purposes, and inclusive communication in multilingual settings. Her scholarly publications have appeared in venues including the Modern Language Journal, Teaching and Teacher Education, and Contemporary French and Francophone Studies, as well as in several edited books. Dr. Jacob Rieker, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, is an assistant research professor and researcher in English for specific purposes and English as a medium of instruction in the Department of Applied Linguistics at the Pennsylvania State University. His research engages Vygotskian social cultural theory, primarily in the context of English medium instruction and second language teacher education, to both document and promote faculty and teacher development. His publications have appeared in venues including second language teacher education, TESOL, EJ, and advances in health science education. He is co-editor with Karen Johnson and Paula Golombek of a recent released book, Transformative L2 Teacher Education Innovations, Insights from Vygotskian Social Cultural Theory. So Meredith and Jacob, it's with you now, and I will give you a 5-minute warning before the end.
All right, thank you very much. We want to start out actually by thanking all of you who are here joining us for this session. We are extremely pleased and excited to actually be in this opportunity to dialogue with all of you about our collective thinking about EMI and English medium education more broadly. We also want to give special thanks to Mustafa and Ben and their whole team for organizing this event, for including us in it, and for being so well organized in organizing the logistics of this time together. So you can see from the title of our talk that it kind of builds on one of the threads that was offered by Rona and Emma in their presentation about this road mapping framework, and that's the theme of professional development for faculty who are teaching in English medium instruction. Right? And so what we're really going to be focusing on today is thinking about how in these types of faculty professional development initiatives, we can think about ways to create positive pedagogical change in ways that improve overall views of what's happening in EME and EMI. And we're going to be talking about the specific example of a faculty professional development initiative that we have been working on in Taiwan, and to tell you more about the impacts that that's had. Yep. So probably goes without saying in this crowd that EMI, or English medium of instruction, that is the teaching of discipline-specific academic content in English, such as electrical engineering, in non-Anglophone context, that is where English is not a dominant language, like in places like Taiwan, is a huge growth area all around the world, right? We know that there's massive investment from many ministries of education, many universities, really all over the globe now, to create new, sometimes entire degree programs in English as a medium of instruction, or at least many more courses that are offered in EMI. And so along with this growth in the teaching of EMI, of course, there's a lot of research on EMI, trying to create a roadmap and better understand the landscape of EMI and how to make it effective. And so we just kind of wanted to highlight some of the major strains of the research that exists in EMI that focus largely on, for example, policy implementation, sometimes with sort of critical perspectives on how policies are being created and how evenly or in what kind of supported ways these policies are being carried out. Also a lot of research on stakeholder perceptions. So how do students feel about EMI? How do faculty feel about it? How do administrators and schools and institutions view this? Also thinking about proficiency, of course, as was mentioned in the prior presentation as well, both on the level of teachers' proficiency to teach competently and comfortably in English, and again, complex disciplinary areas, and also student proficiency in terms of understanding and course performance. And so one way we like to kind of think about these broad areas of research is that they are the march of the Ps. So policy, perceptions, and proficiency. And what we see as kind of an overarching fourth P, which is pessimism. So there's a lot of emphasis in current EMI literature on how challenging EMI is, right? And this can kind of cast somewhat of a, as someone mentioned, fretful glow over EMI. And so our research attempts to kind of rethink this pessimism.
Right. So in trying to think about how we can confront this pessimism, there's a notable lack of research that examines a few what we consider to be important trajectories that need to be pursued, right, in order to do something different. Right. So thinking about this, right, there's a lack of research that asks the question of like how faculty instructional practice might positively impact policy perceptions and proficiency, right? So asking the question, so can the EMI classroom be a site of positive change and development? So for example, can the EMI classroom be the place where student proficiency is built, right? Along with that, there's a notable, there's research that looks at how faculty support initiatives do or do not catalyze instructional improvement and change, right? So the kinds of professional development that we offer, right? It's an empirical question that, to consider. So do EMI faculty development programs work to create change? And if so, how do they do that? And then finally, right, of particular relevance to all of us here today, right, whether we're coming from an EAP, ESP, an SLA, right, teacher education background, applied linguistics, and so on. So how we can best support EMI faculty development given our positionality and our expertise.
So in kind of thinking about those questions, we realize that we feel like there are some really key unaddressed questions in how we think about developing faculty development programs in EMI. And those questions are, and again, these are kind of for broad consideration, who are EMI faculty and who are they not? What do EMI faculty need to know and be able to do to support their students' engagement and learning in English in their discipline-specific courses? And then a third big question, which was, how is this best learned by EMI faculty? And how can we, as language professionals, best contribute to this process of faculty development? So taking these questions in turn, thinking a little bit about who are EMI faculty and who are they not? And again, we're asking this question to figure out how our expertise as language professionals might intersect with, but also differ from the existing kind of knowledge base and pedagogical practices of EMI faculty. And so just looking at a couple of sort of dimensions of who EMI faculty are, well, for one thing, we know that they have high levels of content area expertise, right? Typically, they hold advanced degrees like PhDs or in some cases, master's degrees in their content area. They've typically completed graduate work either in a domestic setting, that is in their L1, possibly also in an Anglophone setting if that's not their L1, or in maybe an EMI program abroad themselves. In terms of other aspects of their sort of linguistic background and their pedagogical background, we know that EMI faculty typically don't see themselves as language teachers and don't intend to become language teachers per se. That's not their area of specialty. But they use ELF for academic publishing, presentations, and work collaboration, often quite frequently. They are also people who tend to teach courses at the university level in their first language, in addition to EMI courses. At the same time, they might also not share the first language of the majority of the student body, which again, kind of drawing on Emma and Rona's comments about how universities are really multilingual sites. This means that faculty themselves may bring in various kinds of their own personal multilingualism that may or may not line up with the kind of ambient situation where they're teaching and with their student body. And then thirdly, in terms of thinking about how faculty orient, these EMI faculty orient to professional development, we know that they may have had little or no prior formal pedagogical professional development and teacher training, either in their first language or in EMI or in any other language. And we also know that they often have very little time to devote to professional development for EMI on top of their sometimes heavy teaching loads, research pressures, and their lives also outside of academia. So those are, in some sense, some of the kind of starting qualities and conditions that we're looking at as we think about how to create professional development for EMI faculty. So in terms of the second question, what do EMI faculty need to know and be able to do to support student engagement and learning in their disciplinary areas in English? We know that a lot of the professional development programs that exist tend to either emphasize the E of EMI, so focus on kind of language, on English itself, in terms of both teacher proficiency and sometimes also in terms of student proficiency. And so a lot of the faculty PD in this area would kind of focus on helping teachers make sure they have kind of appropriate instructional language in English for teaching, for lecturing, signposting, using transitions, giving directions, or they might focus kind of on what we would call comprehensible input enhancement. That is, how to make sure that your teacher lecture is as comprehensible as possible for your students, which might involve simplifying content, using verbal scaffolding, multimodality, et cetera. And what we think is that these kinds of programmings kind of essentially frame EMI faculty to some degree as English language learners, or people who could use additional support in thinking about their English as teachers, or another major strand of professional development, which focuses on the I of EMI, the instructional part, the pedagogy. And there we see that there are often those programs either focus on kind of taking techniques from general education, like sort of student-centered teaching, maybe teaching techniques like think, pair, share, and that often these strategies are also imported from kind of L2 teaching and applied linguistics perspectives, such as task-based language teaching or considerations about translanguaging or language anxiety and things like that. And in this sense, we feel like this kind of programming tends to frame EMI in some sense as kind of novice teachers who are in need of just more kind of pedagogical methods. So when we think about kind of, well, what would be most helpful to faculty and how would this best be learned? And then how can we, with our areas of expertise related to language teaching and thinking about second language acquisition, et cetera, how can we contribute to this process of faculty development? And so we've seen that, again, so far the response in the field has typically been mostly in terms of kind of short-term and somewhat decontextualized professional development, in the sense of like bringing faculty together from lots of different disciplines, for example, at the same time, in the form of like one-off workshops or sometimes sort of one-shot intensive programs that might be a week long, let's say, offered either at a local institution or at an Anglophone university abroad. We know, and this was confirmed by Emma and Rona's presentation as well, that the majority of people who offer these faculty development programs tend to come from TESOL fields, right? EAP, SLA, ESP, et cetera. And that one limitation there is that they do not have and cannot really have the time to gain deep, that is PhD level content area knowledge in the areas of the faculty, the EMI faculty that they're collaborating with or supporting. And more broadly, also in relation to these faculty development programs, there tends to be kind of a lack of assessment of impact in terms of direct application of what is learned in the PD or FD into instructional practices, and also not very much research on then how those potential changes or innovations in instructional practice affect student learning outcomes.
Right. Right. So in light of this, right, so to respond to these three key questions, we contend that the design of and implementation of PD programs must be linked to their impact on EMI faculty, both within and beyond these programs. So thinking about what's happening inside of PD programs and what the goals and objectives of those are, and what the intended, instructional practice and, forms of student learning are beyond, right, the program. And so, thinking about this, right, we were led to ask these questions that we have here with A and B. So do PD programs create observable changes in instructional practices? So that's an empirical question. But then also, if so, how do they create these changes, right? And, in light of thinking about why, institutions, ministries of education, and so on are investing in EMI faculty development, right? We want to see some kind of impact or change on the ways in which students engage and learn through English in their discipline-specific courses, right? So do EMI faculty development programs contribute to positive pedagogical change?
So the reason we're here is that we had a project which was related to EMI faculty development, which was to design, implement, and assess the impact of faculty development, professional development for EMI faculty in the context of Taiwan at a technical university. So, not surprisingly, in order to think about how to create this kind of programming and hopefully make it impactful, we started with doing a needs analysis of the instructional ecology in the context where we were being asked to work. So we did an on-site needs analysis at this partner university in Taiwan, which is a technical university. And this needs analysis included, doing lots of class observations across a range of different disciplines. And we were able to observe live at least one class session of each of the faculty members that we were going to be working with individually. We also conducted a lot of interviews and did focus groups with a variety of stakeholders at the university, including faculty, university administrators, also teaching assistants, other graduate students and undergraduate students, to get a sense of their perceptions of EMI coursework and how it was going, and also their thoughts potentially about how it might be improved. So this is a photograph of us observing an EMI class in Taiwan. We're in the back there, and we'll be talking a little bit more in more detail about this situation in a second. But again, this was just us in action doing this needs analysis. And in terms of what we gleaned from this needs analysis, some of our insights jibed with, I think, a lot of the other literature about EMI, in that there were a number of negative perceptions about student motivation in EMI classes, some concerns about student language proficiency being sufficient for EMI or not sufficient. We saw a lot of examples of basically monologic kind of lecture-based modes of instruction. So that meant correspondingly that there was pretty limited student talk that we observed. And we also saw not that many overt opportunities actually for students to participate actively in these classes in English. We also heard from faculty that they felt that some of the EMI support for them wasn't necessarily particularly applicable to their courses, or they weren't sure how to make it applicable. But at the same time, they expressed a strong desire to improve their EMI teaching and were very interested in new forms of professional development that might be offered to them that would help them kind of move the needle in their teaching. So in relation to our needs analysis, we created a certificate program that we called the Faculty Certificate in Innovation EMI, just to give you a little sense of kind of how we structured the program. It involved kind of 4 main dimensions, kind of a group onboarding workshop in which we kind of presented some common concepts for everyone to sort of have as part of their toolkit, then individual instructional coaching sessions with each of the faculty members, then a community of practice meetings in which faculty kind of shared some of the teaching innovations they were enacting and how those were going and what insights they had had. And then finally, we asked faculty to do kind of an individual e-portfolio related to their EMI teaching to kind of document what changes they had made and why they had made them. So overall, the goal of this faculty certificate program, well, really there were kind of 2 goals: to support EMI faculty, not only in creating instructional innovations in their EMI teaching, that is innovations in relation to what they have been doing, in their prior teaching, something new, but also to develop kind of new forms of thinking or reasoning about their teaching that would kind of motivate and support and make sense of the types of changes they were making in their classroom. And one of the kind of ideals or overarching concepts that we put forth was the idea of taking this stance on English, not as kind of a language system, but rather as a medium for learning and engagement in class. And some, in terms of the sort of sequencing of the overall program, it took place over 4.5 months, a little bit at the end of one semester and the beginning of the next one, but the total time commitment for each faculty participant was only about 10 hours. We worked with, in various cohorts, we've worked with like sort of 10 to 14 faculty members at a time. And almost all of this was done through Google Meet.
Yeah. Right. And so the program in trying to move these teachers and engaging instructional innovations and developing new forms of reasoning, right? This was explicitly grounded in Vygotsky and sociocultural theory and, teacher developmental principles, where the goal of this program, as we were implementing it and engaging with these faculty, was to create change in their instructional practices toward what we might call this ideal or overall goal of English as a medium for engagement or learning, right? So another EME here, but EME and EML. And the goal here was to get the faculty to see their role as something, moving beyond just delivering, or delivering their content objectively through English, but rather where their overarching goal is to get the students to engage and learn, right? And think through the signs of their discipline, right? And that's through English. And so, throughout the program, we offered a set of what we call foundational concepts. And so these are, generally applicable concepts for teaching that, apply across disciplines and, different levels of teaching expertise among faculty to get them to consider, for example, taking the student's perspective and thinking about like what their experience of the instruction might be, and then doing something different from that. And so this is just a table with the data and how we collected it. So we can come back to that later if we have any questions about this. But so essentially what's important here is that across the program, everything was recorded, right? Because part of our, the claim that we're making is that we need to show what's happening inside of these faculty development programs in order to make claims about the impact that they have on teaching practices and student engagement and learning.
And also to be able to identify kind of moments and aspects of the kind of professional development we're offering that turn out to be most impactful for faculty, so we can really build on that as we go forward.
And so in this particular study, that's based on a forthcoming article that I think should be published in the next week or two in the Journal of English Medium Instruction. What we were trying to do is to trace the trajectory of EMI faculty development and then to evaluate its impact on faculty decision-making and innovations. And so in the time that we have left here, we're going to tell you about a focal faculty participant, right? Dr. Wu, who is one of 9 in the initial certificate cohort. And so he is a senior professor in electrical engineering with 10 plus years of EMI teaching experience. So actually, this is among the most teaching experience of EMI faculty at the study site. But he also had more experience than the 10 in Chinese, right? And he had participated in virtually every EMI professional development offering, right, at his university in Taiwan, as well as multiple camps abroad at Anglophone institutions. And so throughout all of his classes, he had a grading policy that was not particular to him, but in fact, it was very common at the study site, where the entire, the entirety of the student's grade was determined by 50% of a midterm and 50% of a final exam. And this was a kind of policy that he had in his EMI courses as well as his Mandarin medium courses. And so this is us observing Dr. Wu's class, right? And so one of the things that we did in the certificate program was observe one lesson of each of the faculty members teaching to get a sense of their current instructional practices, and then to provide the basis for discussion during the 5 individual coaching sessions. And so during the first individual coaching session, what we do is we talk about the class that we observed and, the faculty's reasoning for, that particular lesson, but also their teaching more generally. And so in the first instructional coaching session, Dr. Wu reveals that, he views EMI as a kind of translation, right? Just taking whatever you would teach in Mandarin and bringing it into English. He doesn't take grades for attendance, and there is essentially no stakes for in-class participation because the students don't have to attend at all, right? But what happened was that this would lead to, not only in his EMI, but also Mandarin medium classes, attendance of about 10% out of the total number of students. So in the fact of, so in the case of this class, there's 7 students there, but this course actually had 60 something students enrolled, right? And so, he mentions that, he doesn't want to see this happen, but he still lets them choose, right? So he wants the students to have freedom and agency to pick to come to the class or not, right? And so in the face of this kind of disconnect between his students' class attendance, engagement, and learning and what his ideals were, the coach will offer support there, right? And so one other thing that he mentioned was that all of his courses, these foundational electrical engineering courses that he taught, he had freely available open courseware videos on YouTube, both in Mandarin and in English. And on day one of all of his classes, he would tell his students that viewing the videos online was equivalent to coming to the lectures, right? So as teachers, I think we can understand at this point, right, there's a kind of disconnect, there's a kind of contradiction here. So what the coach does, and in this case, the coach is me actually. And so, we're talking, into being this kind of contradiction between, the Dr. Wu's desire to preserve student agency and letting them come to the class or not, right, if they want. But then the fact that because these videos are offered in Mandarin and that the students could essentially potentially sidestep English entirely in an EMI course, right? And still remain within the bounds of what would be considered legitimate participation for the class. And so, later in this excerpt, right, the coach suggests, right, so there might be value, maybe not every class period, but maybe once a week or something like that, where there's a grade for being there, right? So, like, that were part of their overall grade, it comes from coming to the class and engaging in group activities. And so that might be in Mandarin or English, depending on the type of activity, but that's something that would develop. And so, with this kind of support, right, offered in this excerpt and throughout the instructional coaching sessions, this led Dr. Wu to pursue a number of innovations in his teaching that moved his teaching more in line with his instructional ideals. And so, so jumping forward to the end of the process, right? So this is an excerpt that comes from his ePortfolio final reflection video. So he mentions that, if I didn't join this program, right, I won't assign a new term project and set up this evaluation in a new way, right? And so it was in trying to change, right, the forms of participation, engagement, and learning that his teaching skill grew, right, that his students, right, were able to engage and learn in new ways, and where it created some kind of change in his teaching, whereas before he would only do 50% midterm and 50% final, right?
So I'm just going to talk really briefly about the innovations that he made in his class. There were two. One was to think about, again, instead of just this midterm and final being the whole grade, thinking about creating this kind of poster presentation assignment that the students would work on basically through the whole semester. And so the response from ChatGPT is actually, he asked ChatGPT to generate a number of types of ideas for what kind of student poster presentations they could make that would relate to circuit theory, which was the subject of the class. So this would give the students some sense of how they could experiment and what type of topics would be good for these final posters. And then the right side of the slide shows kind of how he created this grade breakdown where they got a percentage of their grade for these various preparatory steps for leading up to the final poster presentation. Again, something he had not done before. This is just an example of the poster presentation itself. You can see the student will play a short audio in a second. And this is an example of the poster that the student is presenting, which involves documenting a circuit for an everyday object that students use, like a smart home alarm system. We know the audio is not particularly clear, but the student is in fact speaking in English and successfully presenting his ideas to the other students in the group. There were actually, this is a very large poster presentation, tons of students presenting and walking around and listening to each other's poster presentations and asking questions.
Mm-hmm. And this is all among a group of students, right? So these are sophomores, right? So second year students in an undergrad electrical engineering program who are maybe at a B1, right? Maybe approaching a B2, right? So they're using, right, the technical content and, disciplinary, language of electrical engineering to present novel, AI, integrated kinds of work in English.
And then another aspect of instructional innovation for him was to create what he called the flipping classroom on Thursdays. So Tuesdays was a more traditional kind of lecture or explanation-based day. And on Thursdays, it was just a group problem-solving day. And so Thursdays were this chance for the students to apply and try out what they were learning and for him to be able to be kind of responsive to their questions that came up. And you can see here, he's smiling because this is what he had always wanted to do, was just really be able to be responsive to students' needs and questions. So as you see here, he said, oh, they're finally willing to have discussions and they use their brain more. I think this really helps them develop for their present professional skills for the future. And I realized that my teaching doesn't have to be about me telling them directly the answer, but telling them how to think through and think about the problem solving.
Which is something that would be patently, not he would not be able to do in the case of 100% monologic lecture.
Yeah,
And
5 minutes.
so, all right, perfect. All right. And so, in reflecting on his development in the 5th coaching session, he realizes that it was in changing the forms of engagement and participation in his class that this led to new forms of learning for his students. And, in terms of confronting these endemic challenges of EMI, he realized that the way to try and do something different, right, was to actually to change his grading system, right, and to, create reasons for the students to come to class and to engage in particular kinds of, meaning making and problem solving in the case of electrical engineering. And asking more of the students in this case was not about removing their freedom, right, to choose to join the classroom, right? It was about encouraging them to overcome their limitations of EMI, right? So to confront this kind of pessimism and these negative perceptions and concerns about student proficiency in the context of his own course.
So we just wanted to point out just something that he himself created as a kind of artifact to describe how his teaching had changed over the course of the certificate program, which was that he said, I used to think of, and this is the bottom level of this pyramid, that EMI is just represents a change of language that is translating from Mandarin into English. Then he said, I came to think that EMI was about changing my pedagogy in some way. And then he said, now I really realize that EMI is about changing educators' mindsets, their whole way of thinking about education. So again, this was generated by him with the help of AI, but really represents his own understanding of how his whole concept about what EMI teaching is really fundamentally was transformed.
All right, so to summarize what we view as the contributions of this study to my faculty development. So first, right, it demonstrates impact, right? Because there's been a lack of this kind of work, but not only a kind of impact on what happens beyond the professional development program, but where we can see concrete changes in teaching practices and the forms of reasoning that faculty have for what they're doing in their class and why they're doing it, right? And this has been called for by several scholars, right, in the area of EMI and EMI faculty development. And we also wanted to showcase this idea of English as a medium for engagement and learning as a kind of language aware and student development oriented reframing of EMI. Right? And in terms of takeaways, especially for this audience, we're thinking about, so like, what is our role, right, in terms of us being EAP, ESP, ELT, TESOL, applied linguists, language specialists, and so on. Our claim is that we should be the ones to take the first step to enter these disciplinary and pedagogical worlds of the EMI faculty that we work with, right, and making sense of how they make sense of what's happening in their classroom and the role that language plays in creating, right, student learning and engagement. And from this, we contend that professional development can be approached from what we call a reasoning inactivity stance. So this is about the faculty's reasoning, so their sense making in the context of their own teaching. And so this doesn't consist of offering prescriptions for their practice, but rather supporting them in a structured way in imagining what could be, right? So imagining a more ideal pedagogical future through this consistent attunement and responsive support of a more pedagogically knowledgeable other, which is us, right? So applied linguists, right? L2 teacher educators, EAP, ESP specialists, and so on, right? That we can be this more pedagogically knowledgeable other and sounding board, right? And co-imaginer, right? With EMI faculty. And so we want to end with our optimistic and developmental position, or to maybe add a 5th P, our positive, right, position here. And so we contend that changes in EMI teaching practices that emerge from effective faculty support and that enhance content learning through English can serve as this kind of broader motor of change that support higher ed institutions in achieving the promise of EMI as a global educational movement that enhances international collaboration and mobility. So the place where we can look for EMI becoming better is actually in offering better forms of EMI faculty support. And so with that, we want to say thank you for being here, whether you're here online as this is happening synchronously or watching this online on YouTube. We really appreciate you engaging with our thinking and for, for being such a great audience. We're really looking forward to your questions here. And finally, the QR code that was at the beginning of the presentation is the same one that's reproduced here. And this is just to a Google form that asks for your email. And in doing so, there'll be a drop-down box where you can select to receive any of the following, which include the slides from today's presentation, the reference list of the recent publications that we mentioned, and as they concern EMI faculty development, information on an upcoming EMI faculty development edited volume that we're putting together, and then also information about EPIC, which is English for Professional Purposes Intercultural Center, which is a center that we both work within. So with that, we would like to welcome your questions, comments, and thoughts, and to continue this, what we consider to be a really important dialogue. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacob and Meredith.